Hi, and welcome to our live broadcast, The People You'll Meet at ISM World 2025. My name is Dan Zeiger, and I'm a publications manager at Institute for Supply Management. I'm filling in for Angela Miller today and happy to host our event highlighting one of the speakers at the ISM World 2025 Annual Conference, which is June 1 through the 3rd at Orlando, Florida. We hope that the next 30 minutes will be interactive for you as you learn more about conference and get to know Mark Schenecker. Please like and share, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments and we'll address them as time permits. And you can also leave a comment telling us where you're joining us from today and if you have already registered for ISM World 2025, because you might make a virtual connection today that you can follow up with in person at conference. And today we're providing a sneak preview of one of our Insight stage sessions. It's titled, Now is the Time to Invest in the Future of Your Supply Chain. It's not exactly breaking news that geopolitical shifts are altering supply chains, go-to-market strategies, and capital allocation. The key question, is your organization ready to manage these changes? In an always challenging environment, how can companies bolster their resiliency and effectiveness while finding strategies to control costs, mitigate taxes, and reduce risk? Luckily for us, I know just who to ask. Let's welcome Mark Schenecker. He's Vice President of Direct Materials at Coupa. He works on driving business transformation through strategic optimization, technology innovation, and customer-focused solutions. And as you'll see in here today, he's got a wealth of insights on supply chain planning, sourcing, execution, and supplier collaboration. So welcome, Mark. Welcome to LinkedIn Live. And just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about Coupa.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Good morning. And thanks for having me. This is pretty excited. I'm excited about going to ISM. I think the topic, supply chain is just, it's on the tip of everybody's tongue, especially with the tax situation that's happened. Coupa is a procurement solution. We're over $1 billion in revenue, and we have traditionally been we're noted rather for our complete suite of solutions. So everything from initial sourcing, contracting, procurement, and all the way through invoicing. So there's been analysis and analytics. It's all, it's based on an AI platform. There's a roughly, $8 trillion in commerce that has flowed through the platform. 4,000 buyers and 10 million suppliers, conduct commerce in Coupa. So that's kind of the background of the company. We work on materials, services, expenses. If you spend money, Coupa is basically, has solutions that are designed to manage that spend, both, for supply chains, but really our historical has been more in the expenses side and indirect materials. So, and it's now, of course, most of that functionality is highly applicable, and we're going strong into the direct materials area. Mm-hmm. That's the big.
Yeah. Well, I know at the conference you have a anchor booth at the event and a 60-minute inside stage presentation that we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, talk about what attendees can learn from Coupa at the conference, and just give us a little insight on what your presentation is going to be about.
Yeah. So we're really going to focus on kind of what can you do now, right? Mm-hmm. And it has to do with the regards to supply chain volatility. If anything, everything is uncertain. Everything is about the volatility. Where do I build my products? Where do I source my products, my parts, and materials that go into the products that I make? How do I make more informed decisions? So we're going to look at kind of the global trade situation. What's happening with tariffs and how to create. We think the operative word is great flexibility. So one thing we can absolutely be sure of. The supply chain is volatile. We keep saying that, once we get past COVID, it'll settle down. And then now we're dealing with tariffs. But remember, we were also working the earthquake in Japan in 2011, the Brexit, crisis in 2016. So we have a constant series of events that just create volatility in the supply chain. So what we're going to be talking about, or in the presentation specifically, is how do we create an adaptive supply chain? How do we create flexibility that says that disruptions and volatility are the norm, right? It's not the exception. So how do we create, structured analysis and planning tools that basically say, how do we go about dealing with volatility. So in this case, the focus will be on how do I take and reconfigure my supply chain? How do I do it quickly? We know that moving a factory is going to take 3 years, 4 years. What other options do I have for sourcing materials to try to minimize the impact of tariffs? How much we know that we can't pass along the tariff costs. We don't believe, right? Most companies don't believe that you can just pass tariffs, on to the consumer or your customer, another business. So how do I structure my supply chain so that I can get more discrete and more flexibility and more variety in my sourcing, in my product composition, and then how do I get that to market?
Yeah. You did a really good job elucidating a lot of the challenges that supply managers have been facing in the last few years. Kind of reminds me of a question that I regularly ask. Have regularly asked people, during the last few years, and I'll pose it to you right now. I kind of have an idea what your answer might be, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I started to ask, veteran supply management people, is this the most challenging environment that you've ever worked in? At the start, they said, no, Great Recession was still worse. It was still, but as the pandemic started to go on, and not only that, but we had geopolitical issues and climate issues continue to add on. Yeah, people started to say, this is the most challenging supply chain environment I've ever worked in. Just where do you stand, on that dynamic?
So the pandemic was interesting because it was something that we couldn't control, right? This is something, it came from nature. The supply chains broke. I couldn't get materials. I just flat out had factories that were not in operation. So we felt like that the pandemic was out of our direct control, that this was an act of God and an act of nature. Today, I'm feeling it's different because this is something that we're imposing. It's a political agenda. The political agenda for tariffs, for example, is you're trying to get votes. So you talk to basically unions and they want those jobs. B, so it's going to get you reelected. B, you're trying to protect your industries, right? So there's a protectionism type of element to that. C, tariffs are actually a hidden tax. You don't see. I have a 7% sales tax where I live. It's a lot easier to tax a business behind the scenes than it is to raise 7% to 10% on a sales tax. It's a highly unpopular. So you have a lot of reasons for tariffs being in place, but the use of tariffs in basically advancing all three of those agendas is something that's chosen. Okay, it's not something that was forced upon us by an act of nature. So in this particular case, it can be changed, it can be undone. It's declared and then it's rolled back. And then I have a feeling it's going to be declared again, and we're entering this period of negotiations. So I think that this time around, people are looking at it and they see that there is a probable end to it. Whereas with the pandemic, nobody could understand when the pandemic would stop. When do I basically reconfigure, or reinvigorate my supply chains and get my products back out into market? So I think this time around, we feel like there's a little bit more control because it's initiative driven, not natural causes.
Yeah, that's a great overview. Thanks, Marco. That's a great overview of the lay of the land and how we got here. And I guess it's a good point to segue into your insight stage session. Why it's important to invest in the future of your supply chain. And I've noticed in some of the materials that I've seen on it, autonomous procurement is going to be a big theme of your presentation. Just talk about that dynamic a little bit. What are some of the drivers and how can you make a business case for it?
So the part that autonomous procurement plays here, and there's the underlying technologies. This is an AI-driven platform. We have trillions of dollars of spend. So we see where the money is being spent, how much and where the goods are flowing, and we want to use that data. Now it's anonymous, right? But it is the key to providing the basis for good decisions. All great all good decisions, right? Or basically ideally would be backed by data, right? So we try to lead with that in an autonomous way and say, okay, how do we make better informed decisions about where we get materials, and then make predictive decisions around what we think might be the tariff rates for each area. And then once we get that data together, then we create models. So if we say, this part of our supply chain is going to get a 10% tariff, well, let's model it at 15, 20, and 25% as well. And so what happens is, depending on where the market shifts, you move to the model that you've already created. And that will tell you, what the materials are going to cost, what that configuration looks like, what maybe sources of supply you have to change, right? And then how is that going to affect basically your cost of goods? Mm-hmm. So we basically put all of that together. This is also, I should mention, a multidisciplinary. So finance has a huge say here. Your global trade management team has a huge say here. But the operational part of it, in procurement and in the supply chain operations, everything converges on those teams, on the execution. So it's how do you bring all of those factors together to create the best possible plan?
Yeah. What's a good place to start? What are the best procurement processes to start with, when you're thinking about automation?
So the first thing is to set your clear agenda, right? Mm-hmm. So number one, you need to basically be aligned to the organizational, requirements, right? So a lot of times we operate our supply chain and we operate on a sales and operations plan that's been largely in place for years, right? Now, what's happening is the CEO is asking, okay, exactly what are we doing and how are we going to do it? So I think the first thing that's actually a little bit different about our planning is that we have executive oversight like we've never had before, because they are answering to the shareholders that they have, right, or constituents, and they need to answer the questions as directly as possible. So I think the answer starts with the directives from leadership on where we want to go and what the overarching strategy is. Then underneath that, assembling, again, the multidisciplinary team. So I need finance, I need supply chain, I need procurement, and I need everybody working together to say, this is what we're going to do to execute. Now, the operational tools that we use are typically, so we start with getting creative around sourcing. So instead of saying I'm going to source a material for 36 factories and I'll just write a global contract, at a price, I now source materials by every single factory. So what's happened is I have a 36x increase in the amount of work that I'm going to do for sourcing. So there's tools that actually are designed for this specifically to create, large scale, highly efficient sourcing by individual factory locations rather than on a global contract basis. So that would be the first place that I would start in terms of sourcing and contracting different sources of supply for every discrete place that you consume those materials.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to current events. I mean, here's something that, we can directly apply to that. I'm sure a lot of our viewers are probably wondering, how can autonomous procurement help me, navigate the tariff situation?
So I think the key there is going to be around the tariffs are going to tell us what the supply lanes are going to look like, right? So what is we normally would say, okay, I'm going to source the material based on proximity to my factory or my plant, and because I'm going to take into account two key elements of that. One is going to be the cost of the material, and the second is going to be my transportation costs. So now my dimensions are cost of material, my tariff costs, and my transportation costs. There's usually some other fees, but they tend not to move the needle as much. So we basically say now we model the supply chain based on three characteristics. And that's those models or scenarios that say that with tariffs, I now see products in a completely different light. I have a lower cost overall. I may have maybe a slightly higher, acquisition costs for the material, and transportation. But if the tariff outweighs that, then, it no longer becomes the optimal source of supply. So it's basically now just incorporating tariffs into that. So that means that you have to be really close to your harmonized, tax, right? And you have to understand and basically know exactly how every material is going to be treated. And that actually sometimes can be done inside a company. Sometimes you're going to have to use outside resources. But we take that into account now operationally and say that we're going to source and procure materials based on those three key cost drivers for everything that we buy.
Yeah. I know at ISM, whenever we, discuss among subject matter experts or the procurement community in general, tariffs is always an issue that is going to come up regularly. Another issue that has been a hot button topic is artificial intelligence and, the capabilities there. How do we harness it? And I'm sure we'll talk about it in the context, later in the context of our discussion. But I think a good place to start is, talk about the difference between automation and AI.
So automation typically comes around in saying, how can I take the more mundane tasks and apply less, time and labor, from human beings, and more, automation around that, right? So it can be a little bit more rote in it, but it still provides huge operational benefits and just efficiency in cost efficiency. What AI can do for us is, with the right data, right?
All right, it looks like we're having a little technical gremlins with Mark. We will pause for a moment and hope that he can rejoin us, or that his internet connection can rejoin us. So ISM World 2025 is June 1 through the 1st through the 3rd in Orlando, Florida, at the Rosen Shingle Creek Resort. Go to ismworld.org/annual to get registration and more information. And we'll try to land Mark back here with us. All right, we're still trying to connect him, and we'll give it one more minute.
Are we back?
All right. All right, we got you back. We're glad. You were in the process of talking about the difference between automation and AI when you left us. So kind of pick up on that part of it.
Yeah, so automation is definitely more around, the rote tasks involved. If I use AI, for example, and I say, I want to launch an event, I need to find this material. And AI can say, okay, I'm going to identify the top 3 suppliers that I currently work with to buy that material, globally or even regionally. I also identify, for example, AI can say, I'm finding 2 other suppliers that are very active, right, in our network. So we see them in that $7 trillion of spend, and we invite them as well. And AI says, okay, I'm going to collectively pull that together, send it out to the 5 suppliers, get responses back, perform an analysis, because everybody responds a little bit differently in the way that they, package product or materials, and then do an analysis and give it, to the buyer to say, here's our analysis. This is why we think this is the best vendor. And here are the negotiation points that we think you should use based on the other responses that came. So you might pick the 2 top candidates. So what AI did was automate several different decisions in that event rather than just automate rote tasks. And that's the difference between automation and AI. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that you hear about AI for sure is, it's only as good as the inputs that you give it or the data that you feed it. Talk about what kind of data do you need to, enable autonomous decision making, especially when you're in a sourcing environment.
So the first is, we always rely on our own data, what we've been using, who we've been sourcing from, what the performance of that supplier has been. Are they delivering on time? Are they basically invoicing, within tolerance? We look at holistically the data that we have about our own organization. The second aspect, because Coupa basically allows or basically permits all of the data to be shared anonymously. It then says, okay, looking at the trillions of dollars in commerce out there, what can I tap about that type of material? Where is it being sourced from? Where is it flowing? In the network geographically, and use and tap into that, because now the geographic part of that commerce, and you see that shift and saying, okay, steel is now being procured here, and this is why, or aluminum is moving. And those are the first two things that are happening. We know that aluminum and steel, basically these raw commodities, are being affected first and foremost by tariffs more than anything else. So what we're doing is we're not just tapping our own data, we're also tapping into the data for everybody else inside the Coupa community. And of course, it's anonymized, but what it does is it gives you the ability to make more informed decisions about where you might find another source of supply.
Yeah. With that, I'm sure some practitioners would be excited about the potential of, can an autonomous system make sense of unstructured data, like you might see in a contract or an email or something that's a little, talk about, the potential there.
So this is the part that's been kind of interesting in the natural language processing, or what we see that in ChatGPT, for example, and they structured the human language, which I think is just amazing. And they take and say, I'm going to make sense of that. So if I send out an order, a purchase order to a supplier, and they choose to respond back via email, there's manual steps in taking and saying, okay, digest that email, turning it into a supplier response. If I can commit to 75% of what you asked for by the date, and then the other 25% needs to come later. That is a perfect solution for AI, where it basically says, given the order and seeing what the supplier sent back, it has context, and it can actually digest that and apply everything that I just did, right, to the order and create a supplier, confirmation of that purchase order. So it's pretty remarkable. And the same thing happens in contracts. First is when I get that contract, does it adhere to my corporate policies? So if there's a limitation of liability, are there clauses that are required? AI now is so adept at being able to understand, what are the requirements for your organization, and does the contract offered by a supplier or one that they're trying to negotiate conform to the requirements of your company? And you can do this with a remarkable accuracy in terms of saying, this is the clause that basically says, you do not have the indemnification clause required, for us, and here's what it needs to say. So everything from detecting, violations of policy to recommendations on language changes needed. So there's a couple of examples of just how we process unstructured data.
Yeah. My experience in these sessions is that the 30 minutes moves very quickly. And yeah, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. So I'll remind our viewers, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. We do have one that we'll get to very shortly. And I'm not going to get around to all the questions that I had today, but I did want to ask one because I thought it was really interesting before we wrap up. But certainly talent and personnel are something that's going to be very important, in this transition, and just what new roles or skill sets are going to be needed from your, procurement team, as you start moving toward autonomous sourcing.
I think the really interesting part is getting the data, right? So that's something that, first and foremost, the data engineers are going to say, hey, here's my source. When it comes to using AI, it's really all about, being able to we call it prompt, right? Prompt generation. How do I ask the questions to get the answers that I'm looking for? So one of the, I think, more interesting parts of AI is getting an answer or asking a question, right? And then the follow-up questions that go with it, so that you can get the answers you're looking for. And so that kind of prompt generation, or basically the querying capabilities of individuals, the ability to basically say, how do I mine that data? I think is really one of one of the more interesting changes or dynamics in how you look at your resources that work in procurement.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, let's get to questions from the chat. I had it glitched. I hope our viewers didn't, but I can see we're all back, so that's good. But let's get to a question from Samuel. He asks, given the ongoing geopolitical tensions, climate-related disruptions, and the growing emphasis on sustainability and digitalization, how can autonomous supply chain strategy remain resilient and competitive in the current global landscape?
Well, this is, I think the factors that Samuel brings up are absolutely why we want AI, right? Which is, as a worker, a human being, right? I can process so much data and basically make decisions, within the scope of what I know. AI can look at the whole stream, right? They can say, okay, I'm going to look at anything as weather events, risk events, new tariffs that come, and basically make decisions across a vast amount of data and make recommendations that says, this is the action that should be performed based on what it sees. And then, the real issue here is getting AI to not just give you that recommendation, but also why it made that decision. And that's where you create trust, in the AI capabilities working for you. So I think that autonomous procurement and leveraging AI basically says it looks across a much broader set of data than I could possibly see as an individual or as a person.
Yeah. Well, hey, Mark, yeah, I appreciate it. This has been a great discussion. The technical Kremlins have tried to get in our way a little bit, but, we've had an informative time here together. I just want to wrap up, just to give you an opportunity. Was there anything that I haven't asked or that we haven't talked about that you want our viewers to know before we wrap up here?
No, I think that I think overall, right, if there was any time in my career that I've ever seen executive leadership say, what can we do better in our supply chain? It is today. Mm-hmm. And I think that, bringing on, when you say that, products or materials that go into my products are going to rise by 25%, you now have the attention of your leadership and the support to basically say, what can we do differently? What tools do you need? And how can we make that effective very quickly, right? In the near term, midterm, and even long term. So I think, so the takeaway is, as someone who works in this, procurement and in supply chain, I've never seen a time more like now to basically say, this is what we need to make our supply chain more resilient, and to really take on, the volatility that we see, which has been happening for years. So I'd take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah. And I think Coupa has a booth number. Why don't you let the viewers know where they can find you in Orlando?
Is it booth 200? Yeah.
A nice round number for easy to remember. Yeah.
So we'll be there and look forward to seeing everyone.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks a lot, Mark. I really appreciate it. That is Mark Schenecker, and his insight stage session for Coupa is called "Now is the Time to Invest in the Future of Your Supply Chain." I wanted to make sure I got that right. Thanks, Mark, for sharing these insights, and a huge thank you for joining us. We hope that you found some great takeaways, and you'll join us at ISM World 2025 at the Rosen Shingle Creek Resort in Orlando, June 1st through the 3rd. And if you've already registered, we look forward to seeing you. And if you haven't already registered, you can do so and get more information by visiting ismworld.org/annual. For Mark Schenecker and some people who helped us behind the scenes today, Robin Garrison and Valerie Steinberg, my name is Dan Zeiger. Thanks for joining us.